On the 17th of June 2026, at the Palace of Versailles, following dinner between the American and Iranian presidents, a memorandum of understanding was signed. Every analyst, every headline, every pundit immediately focused on two questions. Will Iran give up its enriched uranium? And what happens in 60 days? Wrong questions. Both of them. The most consequential thing that happened in the 2026 Iran war has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. It happened on the 18th of May, 4 weeks before the Versailles signing. On that day, Iran launched a social media account, an official government account, for an institution that did not exist 5 months ago. It was called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. And with that announcement, Iran did something no country has done since the modern era of international maritime law began. It claimed administrative control over the world's most important waterway, not military control, not temporary blockade, administrative control, bureaucratic, systematic, permanent. In the language of game theory, Iran just converted military leverage into economic leverage. I call this the Maritime Leverage Conversion. And by the end of this video, I am going to show you exactly how it was built, step by step, over 4 months, and why I believe the Strait of Hormuz will never fully return to what it was on the 27th of February 2026. Before I show you the evidence, let me be transparent about who I am and what I am doing here. I am not a government analyst. I am not a think tank fellow. I am a researcher who reads primary documents, the actual text of the Memorandum of Understanding, the official statements from the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the Lloyd's List intelligence reports, the Windward Maritime AI tracking data, the U.S. Treasury sanctions warnings, the House of Commons Library briefing paper on Hormuz reopening. I read those, so you do not have to. What I am going to show you is not speculation. Every single claim in this video has a documented source, a date, and an institution behind it. When I say Iran has charged $2 million per VLCC transit, that is from a Jerusalem Post report citing Windward Intelligence and JPMorgan analysis. When I say Iran lost track of the mines it planted in Hormuz, that is from a Wall Street Journal report. I will show you the sources. Let's start at the beginning. Not February 28th, when the war began. 4 months earlier. DHE, Maritime Leverage Conversion. Defined. There is a concept in game theory called leverage conversion. It describes what happens when one player transforms a temporary advantage in one domain, say military force, into a permanent structural advantage in a completely different domain, such as economic control or legal authority. The maritime leverage conversion is what Iran executed in the Strait of Hormuz between February and May 2026. Let me walk you through the exact mechanism. Step 1. You close the strait militarily. You establish that you can deny access. Step 2. While negotiations are underway, you quietly build an administrative system to manage the strait as if you are its legal regulator. Step 3. You reopen the strait under the terms of a ceasefire, but you reopen it under your system, not the previous international arrangement. Step 4. In the ceasefire agreement itself, you secure a 60-day window during which you waive the fees, but you do not dissolve the system. You suspend it, temporarily. The genius of this approach is that you are not breaking the ceasefire. You are operating in full technical compliance with its terms. But underneath the compliance, you have built a new architecture that changes everything about what happens on day 61. Now, let me show you exactly how this was done. ACTONE, THE Timeline OFA, Maritime Takeover, February 28, 2026, Day 1, the United States and Israel begin Operation Epic Fury. Strikes hit Tehran, nuclear facilities, IRGC command. Within hours, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is killed. By the end of the first day, Iran's IRGC Navy announces the Strait of Hormuz closed to all traffic. The WTO later records what happens next, a 95% reduction in ships carrying crude oil through Persian Gulf ports, a 99% reduction in LNG carriers. Pre-war, approximately 140 vessels transited Hormuz every single day. By March 7th, Windward Maritime AI records 3 vessels in a waterway that normally hosts 140. March 13th, 2026. The toll booth appears. This is the date that most analysts missed. On March 13th, 2 weeks into the war, Lloyd's List Intelligence publishes an extraordinary report with the headline. Tehran's toll booth system is now controlling Hormuz traffic. What Lloyd's found was not a theoretical plan. It was an operational system, already running. Vessels wanting to transit Hormuz were contacting the IRGC. They were filling out an Excel spreadsheet. I am not being metaphorical. That is the language used by Brett Erickson of Obsidian Risk Advisors, who describes it exactly. An Excel spreadsheet with more than 40 questions. Origin country, destination, type of vessel value, cargo type, crew nationality, crew count. The IRGC reviewed the answers and issued a green light or red light for transit. The fees, according to reporting from Bloomberg and Lloyd's List, were being denominated not in US dollars, but in Chinese yuan and in cryptocurrency stablecoins. Up to $2 million per VLCC, the giant supertankers that carry the largest crude cargoes. Some vessels paid, some did not. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control immediately warned that any vessel paying the toll might be exposed to sanctions for terrorist financing, since the IRGC is designated a terrorist organization under U.S. law. In other words, if you pay to get through, you might be sanctioned. If you don't pay, you might not get through. That is the asymmetric leverage position Iran built in the first month of the war. May 18th, 2026. Institutionalization on May 18th, exactly 2 months before the Versailles MOU signing. Iran did something that changed the legal and institutional landscape permanently. It formally launched the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the PGSA. This was not a military unit. It was presented as a sovereign regulatory body, similar in presentation to how the Panama Canal Authority manages the Panama Canal, or how the Suez Canal Authority manages the Suez Canal. Iran's Parliament National Security Committee Chairman Ibrahim Azizi described the PGSA as providing what he called specialized services for transit through the strait. The PGSA published a map of its claimed management zone. That map extended deep into the territorial waters of the United Arab Emirates and Oman, 2 countries that had nothing to do with the war. 5 Gulf states immediately warned shipping companies through the International Maritime Organization not to comply. The U.S. Treasury Secretary warned that it would aggressively target any actors involved, directly or indirectly, in facilitating tolls. But here is the critical detail. The PGSA did not dissolve. It did not withdraw its map. It suspended fee collection for 60 days under the MOU. Suspended, not canceled. ACTWO. H.E. Wrong History Eliason. Every analyst who covers this crisis reaches for the same historical analogy, the 1973 Arab oil embargo. I want to argue that this comparison is underestimating what is happening. The 1973 embargo is the obvious analog. But the more accurate comparison is something far more structural and far more dangerous. Here is the 1973 story. Arab oil-producing nations imposed an embargo on countries supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War, primarily the United States and the Netherlands. They removed approximately 4.5 million barrels per day from global supply. Oil prices quadrupled. The U.S. economy entered a recession. The embargo lasted 5 months. When it ended, global oil markets resumed normal operation. Now here's the 2026 Hormuz crisis, by the numbers. The 1973 embargo removed 4.5 million barrels per day. The 2026 Hormuz closure stopped approximately 20 to 21 million barrels per day of petroleum liquids, plus 20% of global LNG. The IEA has called it, in its own language, the biggest oil disruption in history. But here is the deeper difference. The 1973 embargo was a political decision that could be reversed with a political decision. When Arab states decided to end it, the supply returned. The pipes were still there. The infrastructure was intact. The shipping routes were open. You turned a switch off. You turned a switch on. What Iran has done in 2026 is fundamentally different. Iran has not just turned off a switch. It has installed a new switch panel, and it controls the switch panel. The UAE's state oil company has already estimated that full flows through Hormuz will not resume until 2027, even if a deal is reached quickly. That is not because of the mines. The U.S. is demining. It is because the behavioral and institutional architecture around the strait has permanently changed. Saudi Aramco's CEO told investors on the Q1 earnings call that oil markets may not normalize until 2027 if disruption persists past mid-June. JPMorgan calculated that if Iran were permitted to charge toll equivalent fees on Hormuz transit, it could generate $70 to $90 billion in annual revenue. That is not pocket change. That is more than twice Iran's entire pre-war oil export revenue. The 1973 embargo was a weapon that the producers decided to put down. The Maritime Leverage Conversion is a weapon that Iran has built into the permanent architecture of the strait. You cannot unbuild a bureaucracy with a ceasefire agreement. ACT3, DHE, Legal, AR Secure. The semantic trick, that changes everything. Here is where it gets genuinely sophisticated. And I want you to pay attention to the precise language, because this is a case where a single word is doing enormous geopolitical work. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Esmail Bakay made an announcement after the Versailles MOU was signed. He said, "And I am going to give you the exact framing, that vessels transiting the strait would not pay tolls. They would pay service fees for, quote, navigational services, in addition to the measures necessary to protect the environment of the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, and the Sea of Oman." Why does this distinction matter? Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the Strait of Hormuz carries what is known as the right of transit passage. Under that right, coastal states may regulate transit but cannot levy charges on vessels simply for passing through. However, and this is the legal innovation that a maritime lawyer apparently whispered into Iranian ears, pilotage fees and service fees for specific navigational services may be charged under a different legal framework, if you are providing a service: navigation assistance, past obstacles, environmental protection coordination, safety guidance. You may be able to charge for that service. Military historian and intelligence expert Dr. Lynette Nussbacher described this exactly, telling the Jerusalem Post, "There's this idea that the Iranian government is a bunch of maniacs, but clearly there's a maritime lawyer who has spoken up and said that if they charge tolls, they might face years of arbitration. If it's a fee, like a pilotage fee, for getting safely past the obstacles in the strait, then perhaps the arbitration will be quick and straightforward." She noted that the obstacles just so happen to be Iran's anti-ship missiles and drones pointed at the strait. This is what I mean by the maritime leverage conversion. Iran converted military weapons, mines, missiles, drones, into the legal predicate for a navigational service fee. The weapons created the danger. The danger created the need for the service. The service generates the revenue. It is circular, it is sophisticated, and it may be semi-defensible under international law. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Iran will not be permitted to charge tolls or fees under any final agreement. But the question is not what Rubio says. The question is what is written in the MOU. And the MOU, as I showed in my previous video, is a document that both sides can read as requiring the other to go first. The fee question is not resolved. It is deferred. ACT FOIR, HE game theory underneath. When the weak player controls the critical node. There is a concept in game theory called critical node control. It describes a situation in which one player, regardless of overall power, controls a point through which all other players must pass. The player who controls the node does not need to be the strongest player in the system. They just need to control the bottleneck. The Strait of Hormuz is the most extreme example of critical node control in the modern global economy. Here is the arithmetic of dependency. Roughly 20% of global seaborne oil passes through Hormuz. Roughly 20% of global LNG. 80% of Asia's oil imports pass through it. Vietnam holds fewer than 20 days of oil reserves. Qatar's Ras Laffan complex, the world's largest LNG export facility, sits inside the Persian Gulf, entirely dependent on Hormuz. When Iran struck Ras Laffan with drones early in the conflict, Qatar declared force majeure and halted production. Now think about the power asymmetry. Iran's GDP is roughly $400 billion. The United States GDP is $27 trillion, 67 times larger. Iran's navy was, according to Trump's own statements, largely destroyed in the conflict. He claimed 158 Iranian naval vessels were destroyed. Iran lost its supreme leader. Its nuclear facilities were struck. By every conventional military metric, Iran lost this war. And yet, Iran now controls the administrative access to a waterway that handles $1.4 trillion in annual energy trade. This is what asymmetric leverage means. You do not need to be strong everywhere. You need to be strong at one critical point. And the strait is that point. The bypass options exist, but are grossly insufficient. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline can move approximately 5 million barrels per day. The UAE's Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline can move around 1.5 million. Combined, roughly 6.5 million barrels per day of bypass capacity. Pre-war Hormuz traffic, 20 million barrels per day. The gap between bypass capacity and Hormuz volume is 13.5 million barrels per day. That is the leverage. The 5-week report, Control Without Closure, I want to read you a specific passage from the HSToday Maritime Intelligence Analysis published on June 27th, just 2 days ago, because it describes what is happening on the ground right now with forensic precision. The report states, 5 weeks into the ceasefire, Hormuz remains defined by control rather than normalization. Commercial movement continues, but increasingly through selective access, dark operations, IMCON behavior, and staged vessel movement inside protected Iranian waters. The result is an operating environment where Hormuz functions less like a conventional transit corridor and more like a managed maritime zone shaped by staging, surveillance, enforcement, and degraded visibility. IMCON behavior means emissions control. Ships are turning off their AIS transponders, going dark, to avoid detection and verification. On May 5th, Windward tracked 167 commercial vessels in the Hormuz area. Of those, 146 were operating dark. This is what control without closure looks like. The strait is technically open. Ships are technically transiting, but the operating environment has changed permanently. Iran is not blocking traffic. It is managing it. And there is a profound difference between those two things. ACT 5, rating THE Versailles MOU ON Hormuz. Let me now look at what the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding actually says about the Strait of Hormuz. Because there is a gap between what both sides are claiming it says and what it actually says. The MOU, as confirmed by multiple sources, including the Hormuz Strait Monitor Crisis Timeline, covers the following on Hormuz. Toll-free strait reopening for 60 days, Iran clears mines within 30 days, U.S. naval blockade lifted proportionally. Notice what is absent. There is no provision in the MOU about the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. There is no provision requiring Iran to dissolve the PGSA. There is no provision specifying the legal framework for strait administration after day 60. There is no provision specifying whether Iran's claimed management zone, which extends into UAE and Omani territorial waters, is legitimate or not. The MOU says toll-free. Iran says it is not charging tolls. It is charging service fees. These are, in Iran's legal framing, entirely different things. The MOU says Iran and Oman and other Gulf states will negotiate the future administration and maritime services of the waterway during the 60-day window. That is the language from the Newsweek reporting on the MOU. Negotiate. Future administration. Maritime services. Those are not resolved questions. Those are the 60-day agenda. Trump has said the Strait will be permanently toll-free. J.D. Vance has said toll-free for the long term. But neither of them are in the room when Iran's maritime lawyers are writing the legal architecture of the PGSA. And the PGSA is not going anywhere. Here is the key insight. Iran does not need to win the 60-day negotiation. It just needs the negotiation to be inconclusive. Every day the PGSA exists as an institution, even with suspended fees, is a day that its legitimacy as a regulatory body is being established by practice. Precedent in international maritime law is partly built through consistent administrative behavior. Iran is building that precedent right now. 20 o'clock, 2230 vertical bar, 3 falsifiable predictines. 3 falsifiable predictines. CH predictines. Check back N 60 dies. I want to give you 3 specific testable predictions, not vague scenarios. These are falsifiable claims that either come true or they do not. I will return to check them. Prediction 1. The fee system survives the 60-day window. I predict that after day 60, Iran does not dissolve the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. It may rename its fees. It may restructure them. It may temporarily waive them again as part of further negotiations. But the PGSA, as an institution, will survive the 60-day window in some form. The legal architecture will remain. Watch for any Iranian parliamentary action to formalize PGSA authority, any new statements from the Iranian Maritime Committee, any announcement of a modified fee structure described as service charges rather than tolls. The BBC monitoring service has already reported Iran's parliament moving to formalize Hormuz controls as of May 30th. That process does not pause when the MOU is signed. Prediction 2. Shipping returns to no more than 60% of pre-war volume by end of 2026. The UAE state oil company has already said full flows will not resume until 2027. Saudi Aramco's CEO said the same. JPMorgan's analysis suggests the structural damage to shipping patterns is not solved by a ceasefire signing. I predict that by December 31st, 2026, daily transit volume through Hormuz does not exceed 85 ships per day, roughly 60% of the pre-war 140 ship average. This is falsifiable. Watch the Windward Maritime AI daily tracking data. If I am wrong and volumes return above 100 ships per day by October 2026, I will tell you. Prediction 3. The Hormuz question becomes the central deadlock of the 60-day nuclear talks. Nuclear enrichment gets all the attention. But I predict that the Hormuz administrative question, specifically whether Iran's PGSA has any legitimate regulatory role after the 60-day window, becomes the issue that prevents a comprehensive final agreement. Here is the logic. Iran's negotiating position is that it surrendered sovereignty over Hormuz for decades by allowing free passage without administrative control. Iran's Parliament National Security Committee chairman said explicitly, "We had given up our right of sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. We will not permit that again." The United States' position is that Hormuz must be permanently toll-free and under international frameworks. These two positions are structurally irreconcilable. Watch for the Hormuz question to absorb more negotiating time than the uranium enrichment question. question. I want to end with a deeper question that I have been sitting with while researching this video. The Strait of Hormuz has been open to free international navigation since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, nearly half a century. During that entire period, Iran threatened to close it multiple times. During the Iran-Iraq War, during the tanker war of the late 1980s, during multiple periods of U.S. sanctions pressure. Iran never followed through at scale because the economic costs to Iran itself were prohibitive. What changed in 2026 was not Iran's capability. Iran always had the capability to close Hormuz. What changed was the calculation. When the United States and Israel struck Iran with the explicit goal of regime change, when Iran's supreme leader was killed, when nuclear facilities were struck, when 8,000 Iranian military targets were hit, Iran concluded that the cost of not closing Hormuz was higher than the cost of closing it. That is a strategic calculation that has now been made. And once it has been made, it cannot be unmade. Every future U.S. administration, every future Iranian government, every shipping company and insurance underwriter and energy trader in the world now knows that Iran will close Hormuz if it believes its survival is at stake. The question is not whether Iran can be forced to keep Hormuz open. The question is whether a world in which Hormuz can be closed, managed, fee-based, selectively permitted, is compatible with the global energy architecture built over the last 50 years. I do not think it is. I think we are watching the first stages of a structural reorganization of global energy trade. And I think the Maritime Leverage Conversion, Iran's conversion of military closure into administrative control, is the mechanism through which that reorganization begins. Is that catastrophic? Is it manageable? I genuinely do not know yet, but I think it is the right question, and I think you should be asking it. Come back in 60 days. Let's check these predictions together.